All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. Welcome to all of you who are here for today's professional development seminar with a discussion of comprehensive exam or thesis. This is being recorded, and again, I'm going to ask folks to keep yourself muted, and then if you have any questions, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask at any time. Additionally, there is time designated at the very end of the slides that I've prepared to open it up to general questions, because I want to make sure that you leave with answers for everything that you need. Additionally, throughout the time, you can access the chat feature. So down at the bottom of the Zoom screen, if you click on chat, you can submit your question through the chat feature. And again, at the bottom of the chat pop out, you can either send it directly to me or you can send it to everyone. So feel free to use that however you'd like, and I will keep referring back into that chat box to see if you have any questions. So we're going to get started. And again, I'm providing a little bit of an overview of both comprehensive exam or the thesis, and talking a little bit about both of these pieces, pros and cons, and then also just for you to be aware as we move forward about what they really look like. So hopefully folks see the PowerPoint slides that I've prepared on your screen. I'm going to start this morning talking about thesis. So most of you are aware, but some of you who are first years or second years may not necessarily be as clear, but the thesis is embedded within the research core sequence. So your 509 class, your 510 class, and then the 599 class, thesis and parts of thesis are built into these classes. So in the fall 510 class, everyone is required to complete an IRB application and write chapters 2 and 3, which is the lit review and then the methodology plan for an independent research project. Regardless of whether you're doing the thesis option or not, everyone has to do that for that class. For those students who decide that they want to continue on and enroll in the 599 thesis class, they then write chapters 1, chapters 4, and chapters 5 within that class. Chapter 1 is the intro chapter, and that's typically about 7 to 10 pages long. Chapter 4 is your findings section, and the findings chapter is probably, it varies in length depending upon where folks are at in terms of that process, in terms of how long it goes. So for example, if you are somebody who's doing quantitative work, you might have quite a few different pieces in terms of tables and different statistical charts in terms of your work. So that might be a little bit longer, or actually a little bit on the shorter side than qualitative work, because there's more narrative. Typically qualitative finding sections are longer because you're including student quotes and participant information. Chapter 5 is your discussion chapter. That chapter is where you go back to your lit review and you connect how your findings either align with or are distinctly different from previous research on this topic. It's where you outline what your independent research brings that's new to the line of inquiry around this work, and that you're using any theoretical lenses or conceptual frameworks to then analyze your data through that framework or lens. And so again, that chapter can typically be between 15 and 20 pages. So again, just trying to provide some of this as scaffolding to figure out like how long these are. So again, a complete thesis, and if any of you are interested in ever looking at different theses that have been completed recently by counselor ed students or Department of Learning Teaching students, I have several in my office. I'm happy to have you stop by and look at them. Typically, theses are a little bit under 100 pages, typically more in line with 75 pages. And again, these are all built on different assignments in both of these classes, right? My strongest suggestion, and when I've talked with some of you who have talked with me about Thesis, is to try to get as much ahead as possible in 510 to work to move easily into 599. So what I mean by that is, yes, you have your lit review that you are having to finish or try to finish for your final draft for the assignment of 510, but that is not the final draft. So you're going to get feedback on your instructor from that. You're probably not going to have a lot of time to do that in the midst of also having to write your or your methodology plan and to work on your IRB. So typically you're going to get feedback that you have to set aside from your instructor. And so what I mean by trying to work ahead is over break between the semester, taking a look at that work again and trying to make some edits based upon what your previous, what your fall instructor gave you as feedback, and trying to sort of get that into final draft shape. If you do that, that's just going to make your life much easier in the spring when it comes time to do your research. And so you have more time to set aside to really focus on the research and your data collection and your data analysis, rather than trying to refine and finish up any necessary revisions that need to happen for chapter 2 in particular. The thesis is a great option for students who are passionate about research or want to do independent research down the line. So many students sort of think that if you are interested in doing an EDD or a PhD down the road, that you have to do a thesis. And what I want to say to that is that's actually a myth. So you do not need to do a thesis in order to be accepted into a PhD program or an EDD program down the line. I did not do that as a part of my master's program. I chose a different option than the thesis. I chose a seminar paper. And again, no one asked me for a writing sample of any independent research. Now, it does advantage you in that you do have your ability to do research. And so that's great, especially prior to having to do a dissertation and that sort of thing. So there is an advantage to it, certainly, but it is not a prerequisite that you do that. And most graduate programs are never going to ask you to submit your thesis as a writing sample, partly because the faculty don't have time to read it, quite honestly. So I just want to sort of name that for folks to sort of break down, I think, sometimes a misconception or a myth that you have to do thesis if you're looking to get a doctorate later down the line. Thesis does require you, though, to have good writing skills. That doesn't mean that you have to be the best writer, but you do have to have some solid writing skills and that you enjoy writing. You also need to have good organization skills, and you also need to have good drive and motivation. Unlike some of the other classes that you take, an instructor in 599 is not going to give you a hard and fast deadline, with the exception of a couple of different assignments, of when things are due. And so it's on you to work with your instructor to figure out when drafts are going to be due and when you have to submit your work for 599. Now, every instructor is a little bit different about this, and there are going to be some things that are non-negotiables, but you have to also keep in mind that this is something that is going to be driven by you. Corey just asked, is the 599 in the class structured similarly to other classes with class meetings and such? And yes, so the thesis class does meet every week typically. And it is similar, 2.5-hour class. Your instructor is the person who essentially becomes your chair and your committee, right? So unlike other theses or research projects at other institutions, the faculty member of your 599 class is the person who you work with to troubleshoot and get advice, get feedback, and everything. And that instructor is typically providing coaching and consultation to you and your other classmates in the classroom. They're going over APA. They're providing, again, some reminders about different methodologies and how we're talking about that, particularly as we start data collection. And so, again, it's not a full repeat of what you've already covered in 509 or 510, but there are things that we loop back into. when I teach 599, and I can only speak for myself, right? I can't speak for all the other instructors. I also do include a lot of independent work time in the classroom. So I encourage students to bring a laptop or bring a tablet and to be able to work on their writing in the classroom. We do a lot of peer review, so you are required to review at least 1 or 2 students' work, provide some edits and feedback on it. I'm doing that at the same time for my students, and so we have a lot of coaching and conversation about the work happening right in the classroom. The 599 instructors do change every year depending upon who is teaching. So typically 599 instructors in counselor ed, that would be myself. And then we have, again, our adjuncts who are hired for the research. So typically Dr. Merrigan and Dr. Underhill. And then we also have full-time faculty from the Department of Learning and Teaching, like Dr. Martindale, Dr. Lorimer, Dr. Spence, who often are teaching different sections of 599 as well. So it just will sort of depend. Of course, we try to choose folks to teach specifically the paired classes for our counselor ed students. We try to make sure that the faculty who are teaching those also have familiarity and have been working with you. So we try to keep folks consistent, but that doesn't always work in terms of other teaching assignment needs and other things like that. In terms of how many hours per week outside the classroom students spend collecting data, that will vary. So for example, one of the things that I say is to be really realistic about what you can do, right? I think some students come into Thesis thinking that you have to have 200, if you're doing a survey, 200 people who are responding to your survey. And if you're doing qualitative work, that you have to interview 25 people. I say that's nonsense. I don't think that that's possible in a master's student's time frame and the amount of time that you're given for thesis. So data is data, and that is my firm belief. Some of my colleagues may disagree with me, but I don't think that they will. So last year, I was in a situation where a student in the Department of Learning and Teaching was in my class. She's a special ed teacher. She sent home paperwork to ask her parents of her students to participate in a study, and only one parent agreed to do so. So she did her entire master's thesis with one parent and then classroom observations of the parent's child in her classroom. I have had students who have done focus groups, qualitative focus groups, and they've had 2 students participate. That's still data that you get, right? It's about the quality of your work, not necessarily about quantity. And even for quantitative work, right? I had a student several years ago who had over 219 students respond to her survey. And last year, I also had folks in the Department of Learning and Teaching send it out to teachers and only had 7 respondents who fully completed the survey that they constructed. So data will vary, but the amount of time it takes will depend upon the method that you're using, right? So if you're doing quantitative, sending out a survey, your time is going to be spent constructing the survey, right? And making sure that it's good and solid. And so that's probably going to take a fair amount of time, at least, you know, a couple of weeks for you to sort of conceptualize what you want to ask, making sure that the questions are right, getting feedback on it. I'm not exactly sure like how much time, but I would probably say between 10 and 15 hours over the span of a couple of weeks that you would be needing to put together that survey. And then you send out the survey through Qualtrics or however you want to send it out. And then you have to spend some time analyzing that data. And again, some of these systems will, like Qualtrics, will do some of the analysis for you, but it doesn't do everything. So you have to sort of spend some time doing that. I would say for thesis, you're looking to spend probably a good, like if you're doing it well, probably 10 hours a week outside of class, and also counting sometimes in class, for you to be working on your project. So again, if you're working full-time and you have other things going on, these are things that you want to consider in terms of that work. For qualitative, if you're doing interviews or focus groups, you know, again, part of it is going to be dependent upon, you're going to need to set up all those interviews and or a focus group. And again, I would suggest focus group data collection is a great way of going if you can, because you can get maybe 2 to 7 students in a room. And if you do 2 focus groups of about an hour and a half each, that's 3 hours of data that you've collected with a multitude of students and their perspectives, or whoever you're studying. And you don't really have to set up one-on-one interviews unnecessarily. You can still be a good facilitator. You can do some of these things. Now, the big part with qualitative work is that you do have to transcribe the data. And so if you're doing qualitative work, one of the things that I always say is, if you have the ability to send it out for transcription so that you don't have to do it, it will eliminate a lot of unnecessary, or a lot of time that it takes for you to have to listen to the transcript, to listen to the audio recording, and then transcribe into Word the full transcript. And typically there are some more affordable transcription sites, like rev.com is one that I commonly use. It's $1 per minute, but again, that can add up. So part of this is also thinking about what your budget will allow and what makes sense for you in terms of time. I mean, if you have more time, it's always great to transcribe your own data because you're hearing it multiple times. But sometimes, again, in the midst of a busy semester, sometimes we have to send it out. And so if you have the means to do that, that's great. So again, the time that you're spending outside on thesis will vary depending upon your method and your project and the scale in which you're doing it. But again, I encourage you to think about how can you make this a humane process. And so not necessarily thinking that you have to collect a ton of interviews or have hundreds of people take a survey. I promise you'll still get data and you'll still be able to write a full thesis with that data. I want to sort of go to the next in terms of the timeline, right? So just to sort of see what the timeline of thesis in an optimal way will look like. By the end of fall in the 510 class, students have to complete the IRB for review. Over break, I suggest, again, submitting chapters 2 and 3 to your 599 instructor and begin to address feedback from your 510 instructor in your work, so that way you're continuing to do some work. That doesn't mean that you have to be working on this every day over break. It doesn't mean that you actually have to do this at all, right? But this is just, in an optimal world, this is what you might do. By early February, hopefully folks will have already received approval from IRB, and you can begin working on chapter 1 and finish revisions to chapter 2. By late February, early March, beginning data collection. And again, if you have IRB approval, you could certainly start this earlier, right? So if you get IRB approval by the end of fall, you could start data collection in January without a problem. But again, I just know that sometimes things get delayed and things get held up, and so outlining by late February, early March, beginning data collection is important. By spring break, which is this spring, it's the first week of April, you should definitely have moved to full-time data analysis and begin writing chapter 4. In April, you have to complete chapters 4 and 5, finalize changes to chapter 3. And again, when I say finalize chapter 3 changes, what I mean by that is that chapter 3 lays out, as you're writing it, your plan of how you're going to do and construct and implement your study. But sometimes the language, when you write it in the fall, is going to be future tense. So I will do this. In the spring, you have to go back through for the thesis, the final draft of the thesis, and say, I have done this, right? So you have to change the language from future tense to past tense because you will have done that already. And again, there may be some tweaks to the work that you need to outline. Additionally, in April, you have to begin, based upon your instructor and how they're setting up, begin to draft out your poster for the Festival of Scholars presentation. in late April. The last week of April typically is the Festival of Scholars, where you present at the Graduate School of Education Poster Symposium. And so you do have to have your printed poster and be able to talk about that. That does not mean that you have to have finished your data and writing everything up, but you need to have enough data that you can sort of talk to folks and answer questions about what you're finding, even if it's initial findings and you're still tweaking and working on things. To just be able to sort of talk about it will be helpful. It also, by doing this, it does make you start to think through your data a little bit more, and so there may be things that you continue to refine and go back to. So your poster may not necessarily match up with your final draft of your thesis. And then in May, during finals week, you do have to present your final copies of your full thesis to your instructor of the 599 class. So typically that will vary too, but again, for me, I require students to have a bound copy. Just a spiral bound copy, doesn't need to be fancy, but a spiral bound copy that goes onto my bookshelf for future reference. And then also I encourage students to get one for themselves so that they have it as well. So that is sort of a quick and dirty overview of thesis. And again, I'll continue to sort of have time for more questions at the end, but I do want to turn towards the comprehensive exam. So the comprehensive exam is meant to have you draw on the curriculum's core concepts and apply those concepts into practice. This should be information that you should know and be using in the field regularly. So questions on the comps exam, I think some students feel like it's going to be like arcane knowledge that we won't use, but I can't stress enough that comps is not meant to do that. It's not meant to have you think about theories that you're never going to use or theoretical approaches that you never sort of remember. It's meant for you to draw on things that you regularly are using in the field, right? And it's about the theory to practice. So we will give you questions that are scenario-based questions, or we'll give you questions where you're asked to sort of choose a theory of your choice, and then how do you apply that? How would you use that with students in particular situations, right? And it's all connected to the work that you're already doing, hopefully, in the field. Again, as hopefully you know, we offer comps 3 times a year. In January for students who are graduating in spring, for June for students who are trying to take things accelerated or deciding to sort of not have to rush in and study for a test in January, but will sort of delay graduation a little bit. You can still walk in graduation. It just means that you're taking the test after you've walked in graduation. And then September is typically for folks who are trying to graduate in December. So if you're accelerating to do a 7th semester, then typically you take the September exam. We always have a CSP and a PPS exam dependent upon who's enrolled or comps. So we take a look at the roster and we always build out an exam for students who are registered. The test is on a Saturday and it's divided into 2 blocks. There is a 2-hour morning block and a 2-hour afternoon block with an hour break for lunch in between. In each block, you'll be provided 3 questions. 2 of them are choice questions, and what I mean by that is you will be provided 2 different questions and you choose the one that you feel most comfortable answering. They will be on 2 different topics. So let's say, for example, you have one that is on the organ admin class of your respective program, and then another that's about retention or resilience. You get to choose which topic you feel most comfortable with. You answer that question. You don't answer both. You also get 1 forced question. And so there are 2 questions on the entire exam, excuse me, that everyone, regardless of program, has to answer. And so if you think about it, typically the forced question are the things that we pride ourselves on in terms of sort of an overall core curriculum. So as you could imagine, cultural proficiency might be on there. Group counseling might be on there. Micro skills or a combination of micro skills and counseling theory and practice, right? Because these are core counseling courses, these are the types of classes that typically we would have as a forced question that everyone could be able to answer and should be able to answer, right? Those are foundational pieces for us. For the comps as well, you'll be given a computer, so you decide whether you want to type on a Mac or a PC. You let us know, you let Jennifer know when you RSVP, and she'll send out an email to all of the students who are registered to ask for that. You are then placed in the appropriate computer lab on campus, the Mac lab or the PC lab, and you'll be given an identified number. Nowhere on any materials do you put your name. Everything is identified by a number, and when the faculty receive the exams, they are always printed out with a number on it with no identifying information. So when faculty are scoring each exam, we have absolutely no idea who it is who has written that test. And so we go into this not knowing, and that works. And that's really important to us, okay? Each question is graded on a scale of 1 to 4 by faculty members. So only full-time faculty members are the only ones who grade the exams. If you miss 1 or 2 questions, you still pass, but you have to retake those question topics. So you have to come in a couple weeks later or at a time that before the end of that semester to retake those question topics. You'll not get the same question again, but it will be a related topic to what you had missed. If you miss 3 or more questions, you have to retake the exam in its entirety. And again, we would work with you. What I always do is after students who miss 1 or 2 questions or miss 3 or more questions, quite honestly, we try to always set up a meeting so that way the student can come in and meet with me, look at the exam, and we go through line by line, word by word, and we go through and talk about why it is that they got the score that they did. What did they miss? And by and large, typically we will ask on a question, provide 3 specific examples. And oftentimes folks are rushing, the adrenaline's going, and they only provide 1 example, or they don't provide any examples, right? And so it's usually that they've missed something in the question. So and again, much of this is going to be covered in more detail in the comprehensive exam prep workshop. But again, I just encourage folks to think about when you get those exam questions, underline and highlight whatever you need to do to make sure that you know what you have to answer, and then check off that you've actually answered all of those different component parts. The questions are given to you in hard copy. You also get a scrap piece of paper. You can have a pen or pencil with you. So all of those different pieces are there. One of the questions that I got here is on the 1 to 4 scale, what's a passing number? And so anything that is scaled as a 2, which is met with concern, a 3, which is good, and a 4, which is outstanding, those all pass. So really, you're just trying to avoid a 1, right? A 1 is not met, and that means that something didn't get answered in the question, or it was not correctly answered. So really, if you get a 2, 3, or 4, you pass that question. So really, not to say that we're aiming for a low bar of a 2, but you are looking for 2 or higher in order to do that. From the question, another question that I got is from the 3 questions per block. From the 3 questions per block, you have to answer 3. So you have to, there's 1, 2, and 3. So with the 2 choice questions, so each block, you'll technically get 5 questions, and then 4 of those 5 questions are going to be choice questions. So you'll get 1A or 1B, and then a fourth question is number 2, and then 3A and 3B are choice questions. So technically in each block, you're given 5 questions, and you have to answer 3 of them completely. And then I'm going to move to the next, which will give answer to the next question. So the upcoming prep workshop for the comps for January is scheduled for Saturday, November 2nd. This is going to be from 9 until noon in Swenson 105 on the Thousand Oaks campus. This is specifically for those of you who are taking the spring 2020 exam. So, and if you're taking that exam, you'll be taking it on Saturday, January 25th from 9 until, from 9 until 2. You must be checked in by 8:30 a.m. that day with the folks who are running the exam. So I would encourage you to save that date in your calendars now. An email will be coming out on Monday to all students, reaffirming that information and sharing that with everyone. So you're getting that information earlier than other folks who are not on this seminar. If you're taking the spring 2020 exam, you also need to register for EDCG 5XC, that is comprehensive exam, when spring 2020 registration opens in November. So again, registration is not open yet, but in the EDCG list of courses, if you scroll, it's always on the last course on the last page of different courses that we offer in that semester. But you will need to register for that exam if you plan to take the January exam. If you are delaying your comps exam and you decide that you want to take it in summer 2020, that is offered on Saturday, June 13th. And you'll want to register again for EDCG 5XC when summer 2020 registration opens in March 2020. So again, a summer and fall registration opens at the same time in March, and you'll want to register at that point. So again, just to sort of cover benefits to both options, right? So the benefits to comps, in my mind, is that it is less time intensive overall, right? So yes, you have to study for it, but ultimately you take it in one day, you find out what your score is, typically within 6 weeks of you taking it. So we have about 6 weeks turnaround time for the faculty to be able to score all exams and to return back scores and let you know. We try to be quicker than that if possible, but that doesn't always happen depending upon faculty schedules. It is much more practice oriented. So it's much more about theory to practice. And again, it's drawing on coursework that you've already taken. So as you could imagine, like some of the questions that might be on the comps may be very similar to questions that you've had as assignments in different classes. So if you go back and read your papers, if you go back and read the PowerPoint notes and other pieces, if you have a couple of theories that you can sort of feel very confident in knowing backwards and forwards from counseling theory, career, other counseling classes, that's going to be helpful for you. You don't need to know every single thing, but you do need to know what are the general theories that I'm drawn to and that I use often when I am counseling students. What type of approach am I using? And so studying up on those and being able to use that language, that's helpful. It's helpful to also draw upon in terms of your job interviews. So again, many of our questions are scenario-based questions or theory to practice questions that are similar to ones that you might get on a job interview. So again, it's helpful for you to be able to sort of do this because you may be asked some of these questions in an interview process. Additionally, you also have support built in through your peers, and we encourage folks to start study groups and come together and work collaboratively to come up with draft questions, potential questions, all of that. And so that can be a useful tool in being successful in that. Benefits to Thesis. It provides you solid research experience. It can be really helpful if you're particularly interested in a certain student population or a topic. It provides you talking points on job interviews, particularly if your focus is job related. So if you are applying to be a school counselor and you are, your thesis is on a particular topic of resilience, let's say, for English learners, and you're applying for a bilingual position. Well, that would be great because you could sort of talk about data points that you have and sort of make connections in those ways, right? That helps provide some uh, greater insight that you bring something to the job that other folks might not. Additionally, there is support built in through your peers and your instructors. So again, that 599 class has a lot of emphasis on community and getting everybody over the finish line together. And so that becomes really, really important. A couple of questions that came in. In terms of the comps exam, it is, again, only offered those 3 times. So January, June, and September. If a student does not pass the entire exam, typically they are supposed to wait until the next exam is offered to take it. However, you can always request to me, the department chair, that you would prefer that a new test would be given to you within the semester, so that way you could be able to redo the exam. And generally, I'm gonna say yes to that because that's in my power. So that's a time where I feel like that's important. And so, yes, so you can always request that and not have to wait for the next exam. Typically, we do need to have at least a month to sort of have time to put together the questions and everything. But you can certainly request that. You don't have to wait. And again, it does mean that, for example, if you, let's say, for folks who decide, you know what, like I'm graduating in May, right? But taking the test in January feels like it's going to be a lot with everything else that I have going on. And I want to make the decision to move to June. That's fine. You can walk in graduation as long as you have less than 6 units left in your program. And this does not count as units, but it is a graduation requirement. So you could still walk through the graduation ceremony. Your name is printed in the book. You can still go through the whole process, but you just have to finish the June exam. And if that's the case, then your degree can't be posted in May, but it would be posted in August. So part of this is going to be dependent upon your choice in terms of like when you want your degree to be posted. If you want to be out there fully job searching and having your degree posted by June, then ultimately you do need to take the January exam and successfully pass it within that semester, right? If you delay your degree, yes, you have most of your degree finished, but you can't put on your resume that you actually have your degree in hand in May if you are taking the June exam, right? So just wanting to be clear about that. For those students who have accommodation needs, particularly around testing, and potentially with extra time or needing it to be in a private space, we do work with DSS to have that accommodated. So if you need time and a half, or you need double time, or if you need a scribe, if you need whatever it is you need, and as long as it's covered in your accommodations by our DSS office, then yes, we work with you, and we have worked that for many students before. So you do have that option. I encourage you to use it if you have an accommodation. Absolutely, you should be activating those accommodations and using it for comps, because we want you to be successful. We don't want you to be in a situation where you know, you're in a room with a lot of keyboard clacking. We do typically also offer folks earbuds or earplugs, so that way if you get easily distracted, you can put in foam earplugs, so that way you don't hear people next to you clacking away on a computer keyboard. But yeah, that's definitely possible. And then I also got a question here. What if I want to do the thesis, but along the way I decide it's not for me? Can I switch to comps and request to take the exam during the semester after the January exam? It's a great question. Yeah, that you can't do. You can make the decision to go through comps or thesis until by the end of the fall semester, you can basically decide which you want to do. However, you can't start out in a thesis class. I mean, you could technically, if you did an add drop, sure, you could drop thesis, but we wouldn't be able to sort of then create a new exam for you after the January exam had happened. You would have to wait until June. So that is something that you would need to be aware of. So making some decisions about this. At the same time, like you, if that's the case, if you are so on the fence about it, even till now, or even as the fall progresses, I would strongly encourage you to make sure that you do go to the comps prep workshop. Just go through that so that way you get more information about the exam. In that prep workshop, you will be provided sample questions, sample answers, both positive ones and negative ones. You'll be able to sort of go through and get a sense of what classes might be covered. You'll have more information than what I'm able to provide here today. This is just sort of an overview. And then make a better informed decision as you go through the fall. Again, you can go to the first, well, let me see. I have to look at the calendar. So again, if I think about, so January, I'm looking at the January calendar, right? So thesis, the first thesis class is going to be at least the one in Thousand Oaks for CSP. I'm just using that as an example. Would be on Wednesday, January 22nd. The comps is offered that following Saturday. If somebody came to the first class and decided, yeah, I don't want to do this, then yes, you could drop the class and you could take the Saturday comps exam. But again, if you stayed in the class, decided it wasn't for you, you wouldn't necessarily be able to have an exam created for you, unfortunately. So that's a lot of information. We've been going through some of the questions that I've gotten in through the group chat feature here. But does anybody have additional questions? And again, you can feel free to unmute if you'd like and ask it, or continue to send in through the group chat piece here. One question that I did get is it possible for a student to do both the thesis and take the comps? And unfortunately, well, I don't know. That would be a great question. I would need to talk with the other faculty about that. I'm not exactly sure whether that's possible. Again, I don't know that it would, I don't know. I'd need to check into that, quite honestly. And I can follow up with you about that. In terms of the thesis, what I can say though is there will be at least one online, if not two online sections of thesis. So I know for this particular student who's asking the question, they're talking about having to move out of state, and there's some different pieces there for students who, and again, for many of you, if you're hoping to sort of reduce the amount of time that you have to come to campus in the spring semester, you could potentially also look into one of the online sections. That's certainly an option. But again, not everybody is the strongest online learner, so it's important to know yourself and how you best learn. So just keeping that in mind. But again, I will follow up with my colleagues in terms of this question that I got, and I'll be back in touch with you. Any other questions? So yes, so there are multiple sections for thesis, just as there are multiple sections for both 509 and 510. Now, that being said, typically, again, we try to work, so one of the things that I want to say is the Counselor Education Department does not control the 509, 510, and 599 classes. The Department of Learning and Teaching actually is the department who lists those classes. So I try to work with my colleagues in that department so that way our students are able to pair still the class that you have in terms of content and counselor ed with one of the research core classes. And so they're typically paired back to back. But for some students, they decide, you know what, I'd rather only take one class on campus and try to get in an online section. Or I'd rather, instead of having to drive to Thousand Oaks, I'd rather take one of the sections at Oxnard. You're more than welcome to do that. You do not have to take the paired sections that are paired up, but you certainly, we try to have that embedded in the process to just provide as much consistency as possible. But that's your choice. What I will say though is that for the online sections, there are some students in the Department of Learning and Teaching who don't live in the immediate area at all. For example, students in the deaf and hard of hearing program come from across the state. Students in that program live in San Diego, Long Beach, Palm Springs, Bakersfield, and then drive in or have to take online classes. So we have online sections primarily for those students. And so if you're taking a seat away from them, you're going to be moved out if you could potentially, if there's not enough seats for those students, and if you are in a close enough area that you can get to another in-person class. So I do want to sort of say that's important to sort of note that the priority is for DLT students who are out of the area for the online classes, and they will sort of monitor their students and their needs. For the comps workshop, you do need to RSVP for it in the Monday email. It's going to give you instructions for Jennifer's email and to go ahead and to send her an email saying that you'll be attending. So you'll get it on Monday, I promise. Is it discouraged to take a different 599 professor than your 510 professor? Actually, no, it's not. In most cases, I actually think that many of the 599 instructors are different than the 510 instructors, partly because some of us don't teach all the courses. So for example, I don't teach a 509 or 510 class this year, but I am teaching the 599 class on Wednesdays at 4 for students in the, at TO. So, you know, you might have a different 599 instructor than your 510 instructor. If your 510 instructor is teaching at a different time and it works for you though, and you want to stay with that person, by all means you can. It's not a problem. But again, like sometimes it's just about like where folks are placed and who's teaching the specific course at that specific time. And again, not all 510 instructors will teach a 599 class either. So part of it is just dependent upon who's teaching what and what their course loads are. So you might have the shift, and that's okay. Any other questions from folks? So I'm not, okay. Can either delay graduation? Great question. So yes, potentially. Not gonna lie, it could. Does it regularly? No. So to be completely honest and transparent, very few students have delayed graduation based upon comprehensive exam or thesis. In the last 2 years, I've taught thesis, and every single student who is enrolled in my classes gets over the finish line by the last day of classes, right? So I have never had a student in the last 2 years not finish their thesis by the last day of class. I make sure when I'm teaching it that students do that. But there are circumstances and delays that happen. Sometimes it's IRB, sometimes it's about a lack of participants. There are different things that we troubleshoot, and we would certainly work with you. But unlike other institutions, if you take thesis, it does not mean that you're going to be having extra time for your degree. And if there is a need to do an incomplete or an in progress, then certainly I can only speak for myself, but I would be working with that student to finish as quickly as possible. In terms of comps, we have had some students who take comps and then continue to have some issue. But again, that is extremely rare. It is not regular. And typically it's often about life circumstances, or more regularly, it's folks who have taken a time out of the program, stepped away from the program, and then returned from the program. And there's been a number of years that have passed between the time that they've taken classes and then done the comps. And that has caused them to have an increased chance for not passing, because they haven't necessarily gotten up to speed on their own and studying and refreshing the material. Again, for most students pass the exam or have to take one or two questions. It is very rare that students have to take the entire exam over. In the past couple of years, from recent memory, I think that's only happened for less than a handful of students that they've had to take the whole exam over, and it's not even like a full hand, I promise. So it's not very rare that we're able to do that. Am I able to share the percentage of students who typically pass the comps flat out? I don't have that information. I would just say anecdotally from the last few times, you know, I'll talk about, so January is typically our largest exam time. Last January, we had 28 students who took the exam. Actually, sorry, 27 students. One student wasn't able to take it that day. So 27 students who took it that day. Out of those 27 students, we had 5 students who passed it with exemplaries, which means that they got all 4s. So students who pass with all 4s on their questions have get a pass with distinction honor. So we had 5 students out of the 27 who passed with distinction. We had, out of the rest, I believe that there were only 4 students who did not pass 1 or 2 questions. And I do believe that there was 1 student who had to retake the exam in its entirety. That was sort of the breakdown. And that, again, with the exception of having to take the exam in its entirety, that is typically representative. Most students, the overwhelming majority of students, pass the exam. Yeah, pass the exam in its entirety. So if you're graduating in 2021, this is where the math gets fun for me. Okay, so if you're graduating in 2021, and if you're graduating in May, you typically take the January exam. If you're graduating in December 2020, but you would graduate in academic year 2020, 2021, if you're trying to do the 7th semester option, then you would need to take the September 2020 exam. So again, you're always taking it typically in the last semester of your program. And that's important partly because your class content could still be sort of drawn on some of what you're sort of doing in the second to last program. So for example, for PPS, sometimes you might get a question on resilience, or the resiliency class, the 525 class. Well, that class is offered the second to last semester. It's the last fall of your program. If you try to take the exam in September, then that might be like, if that's a choice question, then you might be forced to take the other question that's paired with the resiliency class, right? Similar for folks in CSP, like you might get a question about assessment, which is taken usually at the end of the program. And so again, we want you to be able to sort of have enough choice and flexibility in answering the questions as much as possible. So that's why, again, you're highly encouraged to take the exam in the final semester of your program. So we are almost at time. Any final questions that folks haven't been answered at this point? Again, I just want to reiterate, I'm going to go back to the slide so that way we can sort of see it. The comps prep workshop is going to be on Saturday, November 2nd from 9 till noon in Swenson 105 on the Thousand Oaks campus. This is for students who are taking the spring 2020 exam. In this workshop, more details, more information is going to be shared with you. I strongly recommend it. The prep workshop should only be for folks who are taking the 2020 exam though. So if you are a second year or a first year, don't go to this one, I promise. It's not going to be useful to you. Go to the prep workshop when it is offered for your time that you're taking the exam. If you have questions, you can feel free to reach out to your faculty advisor. You can feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer anything. If you're taking the spring 2020 exam, again, that'll be held on Saturday, January 25th from 9 until 2. You have to be checked in that morning by 8:30, and that takes place again on the Thousand Oaks campus in the computer labs in either Swenson building or the CBET building, which our offices are in, so Spies Borisman. Again, we will let you know where the location is once you are registered. You'll get information from Jennifer regularly about that, and also checking in on what your needs are in terms of a Mac or a PC and all of that. We provide everything for you that day in terms of what you need. You leave your bags at the back of the room, and you're provided your computer, and we work with you to get you what you need for that. Again, if you have other questions, you can please feel free to reach out to us. Happy to do that. But at this point, I think we're gonna call it done. Thank you for joining me this morning. I hope this was informative. I hope this was helpful. Again, this has been recorded and it will be sent out to everyone in the program. So we will continue to forward this out as a resource for folks. And then I'm just gonna look, I think there might be one final. Okay, great. Thank you for joining me, and have a great rest of your weekend. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye, everybody.